Today, or actually yesterday, I'll start off by saying I showed some mechanisms we can use or some techniques we can use to get onto the BIOS despite the presence of signed BIOS enforcement and things of that nature. And my short talk today is about types of things we can do once we're actually on the BIOS flash chip. And I did work, as before, with other people, John Butterworth and Zinu Kova, on this work. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for coming. So yesterday I showed that we can get onto the BIOS, and because of this threat of BIOS rootkits, there have been some technologies that have come out in the past few years that are supposed to combat BIOS and firmware level detection. And trusted computing is one of these things that's supposed to address this problem, in particular the trusted platform module, which is supposed to measure your firmware when your computer boots up and detects malicious firmware modifications. So we wanted to evaluate how this mysterious technology was actually working and if it could be defeated. And obviously, since I'm presenting here today, it can. Okay, so yes, the outline is I'll show you some ways we can, or a way we can defeat the trusted platform module protection of the BIOS. And I'll show you why protecting the BIOS, the current state of the art, is not good enough, it's not acceptable. And I'll do that by showing you some proof of concept BIOS rootkits. And then finally, I won't have much time for today, but we did kind of invent another technique that could be used to possibly improve the state of the art for detecting firmware level malicious modifications. So the trusted platform module was specified a few years ago. Like I said, it's supposed to detect firmware level rootkits, master bootkit rootkits. Basically, any rootkits that can be early in the boot sequence, option ROMs, bootkits, things of that nature, they should be detected by the trusted platform module. And this whole process of measuring all the things that are important in the boot up process is called the static root of trust for measurement. And yeah, it's basically, it starts, there's some code in your BIOS, it measures itself, and then it measures every other important part of the boot process, and all this is incorporated into a series of measurements. So obviously, if those measurements change unexpectedly, it means that you have some kind of rootkit, and this is called the static root of trust for measurement. And all these measurements happen from the TPM, and the measurements are stored in the trusted platform module in kind of a secure way that can't be modified. And yeah, most computers have, or most laptop computers that are designed for enterprise use have these trusted platform modules inside them, and all these measurements basically happen for free. They're probably happening on your Dell laptop and you don't even realize it because no one actually bothers to check the static root of trust for measurement values. So yeah, the key players in this whole static root of trust for measurement game are, of course, the trusted platform module and the platform configuration registers. So TPM can do lots of things like securely generating and storing keys. That's one of its main functions, to act as a root of trust for storage. And then also it has measurement capabilities, and to fulfill those capabilities, it has these platform configuration registers, which store essentially SHA-1 hashes that contain the measurements of your system boot up. And they can only be updated with this extend operation. So the result of this is the attacker can't put an arbitrary value into the PCR value because of the cryptographic properties of the SHA hashing algorithm. So to visualize how this is actually all happening, I just want to show you a visual depiction. The core root of trust for measurement is a subset of the static root of trust for measurement that is essentially responsible for measuring itself and bootstrapping this whole process. And it's really just some code that is on your BIOS. And what happens is your computer turns on, this root of trust for measurement code measures some stuff like itself. You can see it measuring itself there. Then measures a bunch of other stuff that's important and may be infected, like master boot record, option ROMs, etc. And all of these things get put into the trusted platform module PCR values. And I just want to emphasize that these PCR values are important because they're used to make important decisions about your system. If these PCRs change, your TPM will not unlock certain keys. So the theory being, if you have a BIOS rootkit, it won't have access to any TPM protected keys. For instance, BitLocker uses these PCR values to determine whether or not to decrypt your hard drive. And I've seen a lot of organizations use these PCR values as well to determine whether or not to allow a particular computer onto your network. The domain controller will do an exchange with the endpoint's TPM to see, are the measurements good? Should I actually let this on my domain? Because if it has a BIOS rootkit, I want to detect that and not let it connect to the domain. So, as I said before, that's the theory of how this works, but we wanted to look at an actual implementation because obviously implementations often vary drastically from the actual design. So we were looking at the Dell Latitude E6400, just a standard laptop we had access to. And this is what the architecture for that particular laptop looks like. But we can cut this down a little bit to take away the irrelevant parts. Yeah, it's, you have your BIOS chip that's off the LPC, the low pin count bus, and all this stuff gets mirrored and then copied into RAM. So your boot up process essentially looks something like this. As soon as your computer is reset, EIP is set to the reset vector, which is on the flash chip, the BIOS chip. Your BIOS will do some things. In our case, it loaded a series of configuration modules. These configuration modules did a number of things, like change the splash screen on your computer's boot up process. So typically it's a Dell picture, but it could be, it's determined by one of those configuration modules. You could change one of those so that it's any picture you want. But it also does, this sequence does a number of very important things, like instantiating system management mode RAM, which is obviously the RAM associated with the extremely privileged mode of x86 execution. And one of these modules is also associated with doing all these trusted platform measurements. So this is the body of code in the BIOS that says, okay, let's measure parts of the system and put them into these TPM PCRs. And in theory, it should go something like this. The TCG measure module goes off. The entire BIOS is hashed. And that value goes to the trusted platform module. And then the TPM securely records the measurement of the entire BIOS. So that was the theory. And we said, all right, is it actually doing that? Well, let's reverse engineer the entire BIOS and see what is actually happening with the static root of trust for measurement. And this is what we discovered. Theoretically, the SRTM should be measuring the entire BIOS, but in this case, only the gray lines is what was measured. So, 99% of the BIOS was unmeasured. And this actually is not a unique result. Yuri from Intel found something similar with ASUS computers. So there's a general trend that these SRTMs, these root of trust for measurements, are not being implemented correctly. So you could have a BIOS rootkit living in any one of these white regions, and TPM would never detect it. So yeah, we can change lots of the BIOS. TPM will never detect it, but let's assume that the trusted platform module and the SRTM are actually behaving correctly, and a OEM actually came in here and implemented the static root of trust for measurement correctly and measured the entire BIOS. Could we still defeat the trusted platform module then? And the answer is yes. The general methodology we can use is a replay attack. In our case, we use a special Intel JTAG debugger to sniff all of the measurements that were going from the SRTM to the TPM, and we just cancel out the original root of trust for measurement and then replay all of those measurements to the TPM. And then when we get to the operating system, all of the PCRs will be identical to the clean values. Everything will be okay according to the TPM. But obviously, at this point, we can arbitrarily modify the BIOS at will, and TPM won't detect it. So yeah, I said I would show you two proof of concept malwares today, BIOS rootkits. The first one is what we call the tick, and we call it the tick because it embeds itself into the BIOS and it evades detection from the trusted platform module by doing this replay attack. And then the second is the flea, which can literally survive a BIOS reflash attempt. So this is just to underline current BIOS defense mechanisms are not good enough because, one, we cannot detect them, and two, even if we suspect they exist, we can't get rid of them. So for an operating system virus, the first thing you'd probably do is, well, I will just reinstall the operating system because that's the fastest and most assured way to get rid of the virus. But for BIOS case, this methodology will not work because a BIOS rootkit can survive a BIOS reinstallation attempt, as I'll show you with a rootkit, with a proof of concept rootkit. Okay, so this is what the normally happens with the E6400. You can see there's a measurement. We end up with some hash, OX foosball, and we'll say that's the clean measurement that normally goes to the trusted platform module. And our rootkit instead will just be right here with the tick. It will cancel out the original measurements so that no legitimate SRTM measurements occur. And then it will just replay this recorded clean hash to the TPM. And then the platform configuration register associated with all these important measurements will still contain the clean value. So just to show you a little video there. Okay, so at this point, the BIOS has no rootkits installed. I just want to boot up the operating system and show you the clean value for the platform configuration register. Obviously, we have to wait for Windows to boot up. So, yeah, I've written a little kernel driver, which is actually freely available, which will dump out all your TPM measurements. So in this case, just that's probably hard for you guys to read, but we can just copying down a notepad. The original TPM measurement is 5E78, blah, 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 blah. And this is basically what all of our organizations, what everything is going to use for knowing whether or not our BIOS is clean or not. If PCR0 equals this, then everything is okay. What I'm doing now is installing a rootkit into the BIOS, but this particular rootkit will not attempt to fake out the TPM. It's only going to change the boot up image, that Dell picture that you first saw. And that lives on the BIOS and is incorporated into the PCR measurement. It is one of that small 1%, for whatever reason, that's incorporated into the measurement. And you can see that is our BIOS rootkit. It's not actually doing anything except changing the splash screen. But since that was incorporated into the SRTM measurement, PCR0 is going to detect this proof of concept rootkit. The trick hasn't come yet. I promise the trick hasn't come yet, but soon. Because TPM, it will work in this case. So yeah, notice this time the PCR0 value has changed. So if we were using BitLocker would have detected this, wouldn't have unencrypted our hard drives, or our domain controller would not allot us onto the domain because the PCR0 had changed. So TPM has got us this time. Okay, so now I'm installing another rootkit, and this one is a more intelligent. This is the tick, and it's going to record and replay those clean measurements to the trusted platform module. Okay, so TIC is installed. This is our indicator that our proof of concept rootkit actually is on the flash chip. And once again, we'll boot into Windows and check out what our static root of trust for measurement is telling us about the state of the system. So once again, I use special tool to copy the PCR value from the TPM, and you can see that actually it's identical to the clean value. So at this point, the system is completely infected. It has a BIOS rootkit, but we would never know. It's undetectable because the trusted platform module is failing us. So this is a so the takeaway from that is it's evidence that our current BIOS rootkit detection capabilities are not sufficient. We can't detect reliably BIOS level infections. And let's just assume that maybe your IT department suspects that you might have a BIOS rootkit, so we'll do something like an operating system reinstallation and try to manually reflash the BIOS to get rid of any pesky rootkits that we think are on there. And unfortunately for the IT department, this is not going to work in our case because we have the flea that has already infected the BIOS. And what the flea has done is it has hooked the BIOS update routines in a way that if it detects a BIOS update is going to occur, it's going to transpose itself onto the incoming BIOS image as well, so that it will always survive, even in the case of BIOS reflashes. So the update occurs, the flea detects it, it says, yeah, go ahead, transposes itself onto the incoming image, and then it just lets the update occur using the typical Dell code, go ahead. But it ends up still on the flash chip, so we did implement this. Okay, so we have our flea on the computer, and the IT department has detected somehow or suspects that there is a BIOS level rootkit, so they're going to say, well, let's go to the Dell website, get the official clean Dell BIOS image, and reflash that to the BIOS, kind of like reinstalling the OS. And then obviously, that should get rid of any firmware level rootkits that we have on our system. So this is right there. I stopped. What I just ran, this thing in the corner here, was just the official Dell update, BIOS update. I literally just downloaded this from the Dell support website. And it has to reboot to kick off the BIOS update process. And then, okay, we're sanitizing our computer right now by reflashing the BIOS with the legitimate Dell image. Then, obviously, the BIOS update is kind of slow. It's just normally slow, not because we're doing weird stuff, because SPI flash is pretty slow in general. If you were to literally attach electrical probes, is that what you're suggesting? Yeah, if you if you took apart your computer and manually attached probes to the flash chip, it would get rid of it. But it would work there as well, because the code that kicks off the update routine is already burned onto the flash chip, and it would still detect that the update process is occurring from the USB key, and it would end up in the same result. The starting points would just be slightly different. So yeah. He was asked, there's different methods for updating the BIOS. It really depends vendor to vendor. In Dell's case, you launch something from the Windows operating system, but if you have Linux, for instance, you obviously don't do it this way. You create a special like FreeDOS USB stick and put the update image on there, and then launch it from the USB key. But no matter what the methodology is for initiating the BIOS update, you're going to end up calling this code that we've hooked. And from there, the BIOS update image is already in RAM, and that is where we infect it. So no matter what the launch point was, we'd still get to hear where the rootkit has survived the reflash attempt. But yeah, as I was alluding to before, if you were to manually take apart your computer, obviously, and attach an EEPROM programmer, you know, that would get rid of it. But obviously, this is a very expensive operation for an IT department to incur. So, point is, one, current conventional mechanisms for detecting BIOS rootkit aren't good enough. Yeah. And two, we have, you know, we can't really get rid of them either. So things are pretty bad right now in the BIOS malware space for defenders. But actually, we knew about these issues and we wanted to try to correct them. We thought, well, first let me back up. The whole problem here is that the detection code, anything that coexists with the detection code can modify the detection code. So put another way, if you have a kernel virus detector of some sort, kernel antivirus, it can reliably detect user land level malware because it is more privileged and protected from user land. But if you think about it, kernel malware detector cannot reliably detect kernel malware because the kernel malware could just go and infect and scribble all over the code for the malware detector, right? You can't have reliable co-equal detection because what you're detecting can actively manipulate you. So there's two potential approaches to solve this. One is you could move your measurement, your protection, your static root of trust for measurement to a more privileged area, or perhaps a truly non-writable medium, like maybe embedded in the CPU or something. I think Intel is moving in that direction. So you can do that. You can try to go higher or actually not writable. Or you could try to design something that could actually detect a co-equal malware. And this was we spent the last 2 or 3 years working on this, trying to think theoretically if we can detect a malware that exists at the same level as our detection agent. And this is what we call BIOS Chronomancy. I don't really have time to get into all the details because it's honestly very boring and it's very academic and esoteric. But we are releasing a full academic paper at CCS this year in November that talks about how we did this. And what we did was we leveraged existing academic techniques called timing-based attestation. And we apply those to the BIOS realm to try to reliably detect BIOS-level rootkits that exist at the same privilege level, the BIOS or system management mode, as us. And there's been decades of academic work in this area, and I created a little time glider thing, like my colleague Zeno did, that if you're interested in this, I recommend you check it out. It's really cerebrally interesting to think about how could I attempt to detect some malware that was able to modify my code. And how much time do I have, Leo? 5 minutes? Okay, I'll give you just a brief introduction to give you an idea, but I'm sure there's lots of smart people in the audience, and what I describe here, you'll instantly think, I could defeat this. It's quite simple, but if you think that, please go and read the academic paper because this has been a subject of academic research for a long time, and all the attacks you're thinking of have probably been addressed. And if they haven't, well, then you can write an academic paper. So The whole idea is to have a self-checksumming construction that measures your own code, doing like a self-check, as well as measuring any code you want to protect. And with this self-checksum is built in a timing side channel so that if your code is manipulated, it will run slower. So your attacker can modify your self-checksum so that your self-checksum reports, I'm okay, but it's constructed in a way where if an attacker does that, it will be more like I am okay and be much slower. And any verifier will notice the timing slowdown. So this is a toy example. This has many problems with it, but to give you an idea, there's a self-checksum loop. It incorporates some things like the data pointer, what is at the data pointer, so the actual code you're protecting, current instruction pointer, and a nonce, a random value to prevent replay attacks. And it does this millions of times. And let's assume that an attacker wants to have an inline hook or an infection somewhere in this area of code that we're protecting. If they want to do that but still produce the correct self-checksum, they'll have to do something like this. And this is only a few lines of C. It equates to a few lines of x86 assembly. But looped over millions of times, this is millions of extra x86 instructions, and this self-checksum will run slower. And that's the idea. And to time this, we use a special trusted platform module feature that can securely report the time to you in a signed way that you can verify later. So the TPM is like our stopwatch to time this self-checksum. And then any external verifier will get back the actual self-checksum measurement, as well as the start and stop times from the trusted platform module. That way we know what the measurement was and how long it took. And we did actually implement this, and this was with 600,000 iterations of our self-checksum. And you can see in the middle where the attacker starts manipulating the checksum, the timing values go up. But for this number of iterations, there is some overlap. So it's not... Uh-oh. Frederico is coming for me, I believe. What am I about to drink? I don't even know what this is. What is this? Vodka. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Woo. Thank you. Whoa, man. Smooth. Very smooth. Okay. So one thing I've learned in my first time in South America is obviously Argentinians can outdrink Americans. Okay, so just to finish up, if I can, with 625,000 iterations, there's overlap, so potentially with certain outliers we wouldn't detect the presence of the attacker, in which case we just bump up the number of iterations, and obviously we would detect the modification of the self-checksum occurring. So this is one potential way to detect co-equal attackers. We have talked to some BIOS vendors, and one potential problem with implementing this is it will increase the boot time of your system because we're relying on this timing side channel. And many vendors at this point, it's a race to how quickly you can boot up. So we may work with some OEMs to try to implement this, maybe not, but we have some proof of concept code that actually does this. there are a few attacks against this. These have been known in the academic industry for a while, mainly just to let the measurement occur, but get out of the way just in time. This is called talk to attack, time of check, time of use. So yeah, in this case, malware still exists on the system. At this point in the gigabit Ethernet, it lets the measurement occur, and then once it's done, it just goes back on. So this is a practical attack against this particular measurement scheme, and we're working to try to combat this. It's a known problem. We're working by, there's a number of techniques. One is just to go and try to measure all these peripheral places where the rootkit could jump to during the measurement. So yeah, one problem in this space is when I talk to people like the Trusted Computing Group, they say we don't have to worry about this because only signed BIOS updates are allowed to go on the BIOS chip. And obviously I gave a talk about that yesterday. You should not rely on access controls to protect you in this case, because the history of security is the history of access controls being broken. So we need better techniques that can possibly detect co-equal attackers. And also, we need better independent evaluations of these roots of trust for measurements that we're placing a lot of faith in on our system. And the alternative to this is just to move your measurements into truly non-writable code, maybe some special chip on the computer that can never be updated. If you're interested in BIOS work, I don't have much time left, but please come and talk to me. Don't be shy. We've written a number of tools that can help you get started in this domain. One of them is a tool called Copernicus that will just dump your BIOS so you can go and start looking at what's in there. And it does a number of other things as well, like checking your chipset configuration to see if your BIOS is vulnerable or not. So we're currently working with a number of big organizations to run this on hopefully hundreds of thousands of computers to see what percentage of computers out there right now actually have vulnerable BIOSes. Right now we only have like 20,000 data points, but we're finding that a third of computers have writable BIOSes, even the latest ones within the past couple of years, so you could just write directly to the BIOS without having to subvert signed BIOS enforcement like I talked about yesterday. But yeah, please feel free to come up and talk to me, because I know this particular space, the BIOS, looks intimidating, and I thought so as well 1 or 2 years ago when I got into this, but we need more people working. We need more researchers working in this domain. So I wanted to encourage everyone here to get into this domain, and I'd love to talk to you afterwards to help you get started. Thank you. Are there any questions? Time for questions? Yep.
Hola, más que nada una opinión le quería pedir. Es sobre OpenBIOS o Coreboot y aparte de eso, el apoyo que está recibiendo, según sitios de noticias, de AMD y de Google.
Translation?
I want to ask a word about Coreboot,
Yeah.
the OpenBIOS, and the recent news about the support from AMD for future systems. And Google, maybe they have a note in Google, like a hacking story.
So you're asking about how all of this relates to the OpenBIOS projects?
Yes,
correct.
How it works.
So OpenBIOS is interesting. Actually, it was used by Jonathan Broussard in 2012 to write a more portable BIOS rootkit. The problem with BIOS rootkits is they're not portable at all, but OpenBIOS is designed to support many different systems. The problem with OpenBIOS is it does not support the latest chipsets. It only supports pretty old computers. So anything within the past 2-3 years, OpenBIOS will not support. I think the latest it supports is the ICH 7 or 8 chipset.
Pretty old.
Yeah, and so we're up to like ICH 9 or 10 with Intel, so the latest computers don't support that, unfortunately. Did you have any other questions?
Yes, what about the support from AMD or Google, one of the big players?
Support for what in particular are you asking?
I don't know, just reading some news sites about supporting the installation of core boot in their systems, the motherboards for AMD chipsets.
I'm not sure, to be honest, because we have only looked at Intel systems, because Intel is starting to dominate the PC market, as well as our debugging hardware is only compatible with Intel systems. So I can't really speak intelligently about what AMD is doing.
Okay, one more thing.
Yes, sure.
About the size of the ROM for the new BIOS, the UEFI BIOS,
yeah.
that it's growing up.
Yes.
For all the new features for
yeah.
the, I don't know, ASUS or Gigabyte systems that they are putting. I have a motherboard with dual BIOS. One is ROM, one is EEPROM. You can write, and they are not just for recovering, but they are too big. They are like 32 megabytes. And that scares a little because you can put a lot of code in that.
The BIOS updates for the latest systems are like 12 megabytes. They're gigantic. So one problem that I touched on yesterday was the BIOS and SMM code should be regarded as security critical code. And the trend we want to see in these very important bodies of code is the lines of code going down, right? Because the more code, more bugs. But all this code is just rocketing upwards, especially things like system management mode, which are security critical. The amount of code being put in there is ridiculous. So yeah, that is what you're describing is actually part of what I was exploiting yesterday. More and more code, more features in the BIOS, more things you can exploit to get onto the BIOS.
Here. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. No, I'm sorry. I want to ask you if when you get infected, how do you get rid of these rootkits? Is there any way that you can get rid of Flea, for example?
The only way you could do it, I'm thinking if there is another way. The only way I can say for sure that you could do it would be to take apart your computer, attach an EEPROM programmer to your chip, and then manually reflash it. And obviously that is a hugely expensive and dangerous operation. With the current conventional technology, I believe that is the only way. In fact, the tool I showed you, Copernicus, I put it up here just a second ago. This theoretically dumps your BIOS, so maybe you could dump your BIOS and see if it has a rootkit. But actually, if you have a BIOS level rootkit, it can interpose itself on the BIOS read and fake out what is returned by your chip. So we are working on some research that can potentially use TXT technology to reliably read the flash chip without being manipulated. But as far as getting rid of it, the only way I can think of right now would just be to manually make an electrical connection and do it that way.
Okay, thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
Thank you.